Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events. Apart from Ben Franklin with his kite and the creation of our republic, one of the best known yet least understood Philadelphia stories features the legendary family of our guest this evening. In her new book, The Beneficiary, Fortune, Misfortune, and the Story of My Father, Janny Scott tells the multi-generational story of the ways in which financial and genetic inheritance affected members of her family, including her wealthy investment banker forebear, the Colonel, who built the imposing 800-acre estate Androssan. Her grandmother, Helen Hope Montgomery Scott, said to have inspired Katherine Hepburn's character in the Philadelphia story, and her father, Robert Montgomery Scott, a man considered charming yet unknowable, whose tenure as president of the Academy of Music and later the Philadelphia Museum of Art are felt to this day. Ms. Scott reported for the New York Times for 15 years and was part of a team that won the 2000 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. She is also the author of the meticulous biography, A Singular Woman, the untold story of Barack Obama's mother. A reviewer in last Sunday's Times called The Beneficiary a fascinating and judicious book that is often very funny with moments paced like a drawing room comedy. Tonight, Ms. Scott will be in conversation with Bruce Weber, who spent more than 30 years at the Times working variously as a magazine editor and writer, a theater columnist and critic, and a roving national arts correspondent. But he is perhaps best known for his work for many years on the obituary desk of the Times, and now immortalized in the documentary feature Obit. He is also the author of a best-selling book on baseball umpiring and the author of a memoir, Life is a Wheel, based on his 2 solo cross-country rides. He is currently working on a biography of E.L. Doctorow. Please welcome Janny Scott and Bruce Weber to the Free Library.
Welcome to this discussion of The Beneficiary, Janny Scott's remarkable new book. My name is Bruce Weber. And happily for me and for all of you, I'm joined here today by Janny Scott herself. For those of you who don't know Janny, there may be a few of you in the audience, she's a local girl made good, having grown up in extreme circumstances in a large estate on the main line, and having gone to work in a field that is known for its high society connections. She spent 30 years or so working for newspapers, the last of which was the New York Times, where she and I were colleagues for 15 years, and where, and I know this was just said to you before, but I'll say it again, where among her many notable achievements, she was part of the team that created Race in America, a multi-part series of stories illustrating the complexities of racial identity and interracial relationships that won a Pulitzer Prize. After leaving the Times, she wrote us a biography of Stanley Ann Dunham called A Singular Woman, the Untold Story of Barack Obama's Mother, that answered many more questions about our previous president than the president did himself. But that's just the resume. Then there is the undisputed fact that Janny is just a terrific journalist. Unlike those of many of us who are better writers than we are reporters, or the other way around, Janny's gifts in that regard finish in a dead heat. She's superb at both, and The Beneficiary is the perfect exemplar of that. The Beneficiary is a family memoir about an upper-class family from the Philadelphia main line. It goes back 3 generations to the turn of the 20th century on one side of Janny's father's family, the Montgomerys, whose fortune was made in banking, and 4 generations on the other side, the Scotts, to a 19th century railroad mogul. Now, to say that these clans were privileged and that their union created a substantial fortune is to badly understate the case. And to make that point, I'm going to ask Janny to read 2 short passages from the book, one which is about sheer extravagance, and the other which is about the circles in which the super affluent are wont to move.
This is from a lengthy description of the creation of Androssan and follows a moment in which my father's grandfather decided to build a forest, install a forest, ostensibly to block the view of another estate, another house going up nearby. I'm just going to quote this last bit before it, because as Kaufman had said of the hundreds of trees transplanted on Moss Hart's estate, just what God would have done if he had the money. So the following spring, the planting extravaganza resumed. 10,000 rhododendron bushes were ordered for the woods on the Montgomery holdings. 700 linear feet of privet went in along the boundary to the south. On the high banks of the long, straight road that served as the property line to the north, 1,250 climbing roses took root. 750 honeysuckle plants arrived from a local nursery. In April and May, landscapers installed 24 purple beech tree, 24 junipers, 36 white dogwoods, 4 hemlocks, and dozens of snowballs, lilacs, forsythias, mock oranges, hydrangeas, and box trees. For the landscaping around the new swimming pool, 900 ferns were trucked in. The lawns spilling away from the big house were planted with nearly 500 trees. 600 cowslip, rock cress, white stonecrop, and other small flowering perennials arrived from a nursery in Vermont, along with instructions from a famous landscape architect in Manhattan to plant them in the cracks of rocks. The colonel furnished himself, too, with the ultimate gentleman's accessory, a herd of cows. And this second one is, we would go straight into it?
Yeah, sure.
About my grandparents, Helen Hope Montgomery Scott and Edgar Scott, and the remarkable lives that they lived, my father's parents. The stories my grandparents told teemed with names I should have known and sometimes didn't. Names like Josephine Baker, the Stork Club, the Duke of Windsor. My grandmother persuaded him to stand on his head, it was said, so she could find out what he wore under his kilt. I was stuck with Winston Churchill one Christmas on Aristotle Onassis's yacht, was the sort of thing she sometimes said and once did. I didn't know what to say. I asked him about the weather, and he just grunted. As they handed him a double martini, I said, "Sir, I heard it was a very windy crossing at Gibraltar. Were you seasick?" She had a rollicking narrative style, not unlike the voice in Eloise at the Plaza. People in her stories were always throwing a fit, falling right down with apoplexy, going mad. A flight attendant was, quote, a buxom stewardess with a hangover who looks like a sow, unquote. A man with designs on her was, quote, so tight he could barely dance, unquote. In the service of a laugh, she had few qualms about making herself look preposterous. Quote, he asked me, did I know Goya, she once said, recalling her first encounter with the portrait painter Augustus John. I was so shy, I said, yes, I often see him at parties.
It's hard to resist quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald here, and his famous line from one of his short stories, let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. But what's especially remarkable about The Beneficiary is that it is written from both within and without, as one of them and one of you and me. Our narrator has her feet firmly in both camps. She's a Scot, of course, and she's also a clear-eyed observer of the Scots. As the New Yorker said of the book, it's written, quote, with pitiless wit and something like love. So, Jani, that's where I want to start. What's it like being the descendant of robber barons?
You think I'd even admit that in public, before a crowd like this? Plus, Bruce, we're in Philadelphia. There may be some other people flying under the radar out there. Before I answer Bruce's question, I just want to thank the library for having us, and all of you for coming, and Bruce, my fabulous friend and colleague, for coming, whose work I so admire, for coming to help me explain myself to you. So, for the record, there's really only one certified robber baron in this story, and that's Thomas Alexander Scott, who was a tavern owner's son who rose to become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad when it was the largest freight carrier in the world and the most profitable corporation in North America. He has been said to have been the the quintessential railroad man of his age. And when he died, I'm told that every engine, car, and station in the Pennsylvania railroad system was draped in black for an entire month. The sort of aspiring robber baron in this story is my father's maternal grandfather, Robert Leeming Montgomery, also known as the Colonel, for reasons that I came to suspect were discreetly forgotten. He left school very early, went into investment banking right at the moment when the market for industrial securities was being born, made a lot of money very fast before and during World War I, married the daughter of an extremely successful, wealthy Philadelphia banker, and the two of them, in the years leading up to World War I, hired the sort of architect to plutocrats of the day, Horace Trumbauer, whose firm, I think, had something to do with the Free Library, hired him to build for them a 50-room house. They then acquired hundreds and hundreds of acres of farmland, beautiful farmland all around, and created a family compound into which they installed their children and their children's children. By the time I was born, there were 4 generations of my father's family living on this place, which many of you are probably familiar with, which I would say now was a bit like a British country estate, straight from the pages of Jane Austen and Henry James, that had been floated across the Atlantic and installed among the suburban swimming pools of John Updike and John Cheever. So getting back to the question, I have to say that I feel as though being a descendant of at least one robber baron has affected me barely at all, and that it has nothing to do with me, but I concede that perhaps others would say otherwise.
Well, to continue in that vein, this is a very personal book by and large, especially when you get to your father, and what I will discreetly refer to as his foibles. Did you struggle with how revealing to be about your family in general and your father in particular?
I did struggle, but not entirely at the beginning, not when I began this project. I did not set out to write an expose of my father or his family or blow the lid off the Montgomerys and the Scotts. I was motivated by several things quite different. I wanted to write about the world that the Colonel had created and that had shaped, as far as I could tell, the experiences in life of my grandmother, my father, me, and so many of us. This world that had been created and carried on almost miraculously into the 21st century. I also had found my father to be a considerable puzzle. I adored my father, but I found him quite unknowable in some ways, and I thought that possibly if I understood more about the inception and evolution of Androssan, that I could perhaps understand something about my father. Particularly, I had been haunted by the end of his life and his death, which in 2005, which to me seemed to be the culmination of a lengthy, protracted process of self-destruction. So those were the things that drove me, and I had the tools available to me, which were, I was an experienced newspaper reporter, so I was pathologically curious. I had some familiarity with archival material, and it turned out that in the big house at Androssan, there were heaps and heaps of papers dating back to the mid-19th century. And I also had some professional experience of asking people questions that they're not used to being asked and actually getting them to answer. Mm-hmm. So I immersed myself in this material through those topics, through those approaches, and it's true, at a certain point, the story turned much more complicated than I had really anticipated. It's not that I thought I was embarking upon something simple, but some people would say what emerged was a sort of darker part of the story. And it was at that point that I began losing sleep and wondering why I had gotten myself into this and how I was going to get myself out of it. So I have to say that looking back, I had three choices at that point. Should I abandon the whole thing to avoid angering and distressing people I cared about and loved? Should I tone down the darker material or just not put it in order to shield people from the information that might set their hair on fire? Or should I immerse myself more deeply, embrace the complexities, and see what I could do to write about these interesting, complicated people and this relatively unexplored world, it seemed to me, with nuance and sensitivity and respect for the complexity of them as humans. I guess you know which one I chose.
Just before we go on, I'm going to ask you some more about that, but just before we go on, how has your family reacted to the book?
Mostly very positively. My family, as many of you probably know, many of you are in my family, people are careful, I think, to not tread on other people's liberties, and I don't think people in my family would, fly off the handle and really lay it on the line. I'm sure people have reservations. People have reservations about anything one reads and one writes, and I anticipated that. But I showed it to my mother and my siblings and my father's brother before I submitted it, and I knew that they were okay with it. And since then, I've gradually, much closer to publication, also sent it to some other relatives, and others have seen it on their own. And I would say really all but one person who wrote to me a rather pained, lengthy email about it. Everybody else has been really enthusiastic, which I think is kind of amazing, and I wonder what they're holding back. I wanted to say one other thing about the question you asked before you said, particularly your father. Did I concern myself about revealing things? Well, I confess to you that to the extent that I thought about what I might withhold about my father, it was not to protect his good name, because I think my father was relatively open about some of the choices he made, and I think there are a lot of things in here that people don't know the details, but they probably don't surprise people who knew him all that much. Frankly, and this may sound really craven and writerly, I was more concerned about the dramatic question. I wanted to establish very clearly in the first half of the book the character of my father and what was remarkable about him. His incredible charm, his intelligence, his devotion to his parents, his humor, and many, many other wonderful qualities. And because I wanted the reader to feel that so deeply so that when they came to this more dark material, they would feel the loss that I felt. So there are some things, perhaps people who've read the book will be surprised to hear that I did withhold a few things, and it was partly in the service of that I wanted the reader never to feel like they lost empathy for my subjects.
Well, let's get a little bit more specific. You called the book The Beneficiary, which has a number of different connotations. So this next question, or several questions or comments, falls under the rubric of will you explain the title? But you talked about you wanted people to know your father. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about his habits, his astonishing qualities and astonishing habits? I'm a long-distance bicyclist, and Janny's father could get drunk as a skunk and then go out and ride 100 miles on a bicycle the next day, which I just find astonishing. And a little bit more about the difficulty of assessing his character. And perhaps this is also the time in which we ought to introduce the major discovery that you made during the writing of this book that allowed you to answer some of the questions that I'm asking you now.
I always thought of my father as a rather remarkable character. He had inherited enormous advantages through his family and wonderful qualities, many of which I just listed. Extraordinary charm, intelligence, humor. He was well educated. He then took his talents and his those fine qualities and applied them to wonderful things that helped in many ways other people. Served certainly Philadelphia well. He was from early on a sort of public-spirited, socially minded patrician of that sort, and he was always involved in many organizations. And then, of course, as was mentioned before, he went to England as special assistant to Walter Annenberg, and then he returned and was president of the Academy of Music, and then the Art Museum, during which time the endowment was increased fivefold, attendance soared. Some of this obviously had to do with Anne Darnelcourt as well as him, and it was, I think, quite a success. So by measures of human qualities and accomplishment, a remarkable soul. He also, as Bruce alluded to, was a striking physical specimen, incredibly physically strong. I was on a number of those bike trips. We went to Ireland, New Zealand, and China together on long distance bike touring trips. My father, in his 50s and 60s, would ride at the head of the pack. He made a point of being at the head of the pack, and priding himself on outpacing people half his age. And then at night, he would drink himself into close to a stupor and get up the next morning and do the same thing again. And you have to, you have to admire that on one level. At the same time, my father was a mystery to me. From an early age, I remember him saying things like, he would refer to the black dog, which I now know was a term that Winston Churchill used for his severe depressions. He said a number of times when I was younger that he figured he'd be dead by 50, which seemed like an odd thing to say when his parents and grandparents were living into their 90s. I remember coming to Philadelphia not long before his death, and he was being awarded the Crystal Award, which was in honor of his manifest contributions to the arts and culture in the city. He was in pretty bad health, in a wheelchair, and they wheeled him up onto the stage of the Union League and left him there, and he embarked upon his speech, and he said, "When I first learned that they were going to give me the Crystal Award, I thought, perfect, you can see right through it." Now, that is a puzzling man. These were some of the things that I wanted to try to understand. And what Bruce alluded to is that my father had, when I was in my 20s, had just out of the blue one day said, "I want you to have my diaries when I die." And I knew my father kept diaries. He did it assiduously. And I was admired and was fascinated by my father, and I was enormously flattered by this offer, but also taken aback. And I said, "Well, why me?" And he said, "You're the writer." And that was it. And I never dared bring it up again because I was afraid he'd withdraw the offer. And when he died, the diaries were nowhere to be found. And I've made some attempt when I started working on the project to find them and track down a handful of them out of state. And then I finally gave up, and I was writing the book. I was about the third chapter in, and I happened to be in my mother's house, the house that my father had left 20 years earlier, and I happened upon a single volume from the 1950s when he was in his mid-20s and early on in his marriage and right around the time that his first child was born. And it was just a short series of entries, about 20 pages, and I was blown away by the writing, the feeling, the thinking, and what he said about his life, the intense, excruciating sensitivity to his own situation. And I realized, I really have to find the rest of them again. And it never occurred to me they'd be in my mother's house. Why would he have left them there? So I searched the entire house, and to make a long story short, in the very last place make a long story longer, in the very last place I looked, there in this closet on the third floor in the back part of the house was this chest with a padlock on it, and I hadn't seen the chest there before, and I approached it, and the padlock was set to 1 digit off the last 4 digits of the longtime phone number for that house, which was always the number we used for combination locks. So I turned it that one number, it clicked open, flipped open the top, and there was 40 years of diaries in identical black 3-ring binders, all organized chronologically, and as far as I can tell, waiting to be discovered. And it was those diaries that really, for me, unlocked a lot of the mystery of my father. He's 25 or 26 at this point. I take my diary down from the shelf and I begin to write when I am in moods of reappraisal and reform. Judging from the dates of the entries in this volume, the moods are becoming less frequent, but their sensible intensity does not seem to have diminished. Formerly, the moods were short, a day or two of depression or elation, and the episode soon forgotten. This time it has been much longer. For almost 3 weeks now, the mood and I have been cohabiting rather regularly. Perhaps it's the influence of vacation. The urge to create for the satisfaction of creating runs strong during these moods. I would try to write a novel, perhaps built on a projection of my grandfather Montgomery's life. Since I've never tried to write and never had any reason to believe I had any ability to do so, I read instead. The reading slowly stimulates the urge to write. Tonight, my first preoccupation is that I feel enormously dull. Aiming to please, I am first upset by the fact that I am, and have for a long time, been unable to dredge up topics of conversation, am unable to amuse. I am also dull to myself. I do not bore myself, as I do not sigh and wish myself away when I'm alone, but I know within myself that I am not only uninteresting, but uninterested. I am dull to other people and to myself because there is very little other than myself that I care about. There is nothing which I find exciting, stimulating, except the things which I do alone, unanalyzed and unspoken. Work, perhaps, beagling, reading, drinking, perhaps. I am cold in the sense of being dead to so much. Short in values and interests, my horizon is illumined by the glow of human admiration. Without that glow, I am undirected. Just going to read one other section. I am now 26 years old. I live in a beautiful formal house with grounds which I cannot afford to keep on a decaying quasi-baronial domain of great beauty in an encroaching suburb. I am a graduate of a law school and paid to practice law by a rather good stuffy law firm, and I am quite mediocre about it. Blah, blah, blah. Hang on a second. I am married to a charming wife with whom I have little in common but background. My failure at the tennis court eliminated what she felt to be the sphere in which we would have experiences together, and the result is that we have no common experiences except our background. We live our background. And then finally, he goes on to say, but the fault is all in me and not the environment. There's nothing else I want, nowhere else I want to live, no other woman I want to marry, no other background I want to accumulate. No, I must attack my own spirit to find and cure. I cause my own sterility. I make myself into a pompous ass. And then at the end he says, more likely I should practice each day going forth to live.
One of the themes of the book is how both actual wealth and the idea of wealth travel down through time. So I'll ask you, what do you think the experience of your family has to say about the nature of affluence in our country today?
Well, the thing that struck me in looking at all this story was how similar what's happening today is to what happened at the turn of the last century. The way that money is being made now and the way it's being spent or invested or put away into land and property and houses and family compounds, it's all so similar. And the sort of markers of arrival are very much the same. In my father's family, money and property was put in trust, partly in order, according to my uncle, for tax avoidance purposes. You notice that the creation of the trusts are sort of timed exactly to the income of the arrival of the estate tax, the arrival of the income tax. And I just thought, so much effort goes into making this money and then putting it away and making sure it's going to last for generation after generation after generation, and how much thought goes into how this is going to play out in the different personalities and different individuals in those subsequent generations. So I was just trying to raise the question. Somewhere out there now, another Androssan is being born. You know, maybe it's in China or Mumbai or who knows. And people are doing many of the same things. And I'm just wondering, do they think in the long run how this is going to play out for their descendants, or is their focus elsewhere?
It was very interesting to hear you talk about how you structured the book, because when I read it and you got to that passage that you just read about him being 26 and sort of feeling he had nothing left, it was a punch in the stomach. It was like I had to put the book down. And I wondered, for you, what was it like to come upon that kind of sadness at such a young age in your father?
Sobering. It was, well, it explained so much, actually. And it was part of, as I say, I came upon then all the rest of the diaries, and so I spent months reading through them. And, you know, on one level, it was sort of suffocating and painful. And on another level, it was a great relief to sort of understand him in that level, at that level, and to understand those feelings better. But I also was left really with a feeling of wonderment about why he did it this way. He tells me he wants the diaries. It's never mentioned again. He leaves them, you know, locked in a place where someone will eventually find them with the combination set one digit off. It was this, did he want it to be discovered? He wanted it to be understood only later after he was dead? I don't know. So it left me with a whole mix of feelings, as you can imagine. Amazement, distress, and more puzzlement.
Yeah, Jani, this is such emotional stuff, and yet you wrote the book with such kind of control and dispassion. And I guess I want to know, did you struggle over the tone of the book?
I did. I did. The tone, I'd say, was the hardest part of a pretty hard project in general. I did not, as I said, you know, embark on this project to settle scores. I had no bitterness or particular sentimentality. I wanted to tell the story and not slide over the edge into one of those feelings or another, which over time, in working on the writing, I got the sense that bitterness and sentimentality are sort of the cliche for the memoir writer, and they're like the default position. And if you're not really careful, the easy thing is to go one way or the other. And since I didn't feel those things, I had to constantly go back and scrub and scrub and scrub at the sentences and the paragraphs to make sure that it wasn't that. And I do think that the voice of it is what I wanted, which is how I feel about it, and is also my way of wrestling with, I think, emotionally complicated material, which is to kind of report it out and write it down.
I was wondering, your father was so young when he wrote that, and he sounded so depressed about his environment or, you know, his life. And he, as well as you, being descendants of very wealthy families, is it such a burden, do you think, for almost everyone is a descendant, that they have to do something with that they're figuring out who they are, they have less freedoms? Could that be something that you've seen?
I think it really, I didn't talk about other family members. I think it works differently for different people. My grandmother, I think in many ways, was hugely successful at being the part of that whole clan. And my father was too in many ways, but I think she was less, I'm guessing, was probably less troubled by it in some ways. And my father did do what he vowed to do, kind of go out and figure out how to live, and you know, made something of that as well as of himself. He figured it out to some extent, but he never stopped drinking. He drank himself to death. So, I mean, I didn't write this to create sympathy for highly privileged people. That's actually, the tone question is also related to that this is not a time in which there's a lot of sympathy for privilege, and this is not a particularly fashionable subject at this moment. So I knew that any sympathy that people were going to feel for these characters had to be earned by what they said and what they did, and not by any emotion that I injected into the narrative.
Depression runs in your family, and there was at least one suicide that I knew about. Did you discover that in your research, and how did it make you feel about your own risk?
The suicide, which was my father's paternal grandfather, was really covered up in the family. He was said to have died, in World War I, under vague circumstances. The kind of story told was that he had worked himself to the bone and developed pneumonia. Well, first it was developed dysentery, but then they turned it into pneumonia. So that story was, I didn't personally, I think my father told me when I was in my 20s or 30s on one of the bicycle trips, he told me that his grandfather had killed himself and that his father had never spoken to him about it, never once. And I did find, through circuitously, a series of letters that explained exactly what happened in France. And it did seem to be, my father believed that his grandfather had, I don't know how he came up with this diagnosis, but that he was somewhat bipolar. And it does seem from the descriptions in these letters by a cousin of his who was there, that his grandfather experienced a lot of mood imbalances and also drank much too much, and that it was definitely drinking related when he killed himself. It was during the war. I'm 63, and I think if I had a tendency toward depression, I probably would know it by now. So I didn't feel like I was, suddenly aware of a new risk, but I know that a cousin of my father's, whose sister did commit suicide, felt that the decision by the family to bury these letters that I ultimately use in the book was an unwise decision, because he feels that it would be useful for subsequent generations to understand that history.
Yes, in your research and the book, did you find out enough about the investment firm Janny Montgomery Scott, the evolution of it, and so forth?
I found out quite a bit. Not so much the Jani part of it, but the Montgomery Scott part. It's in the book. My great-grandfather, the Colonel, formed, I think it's Montgomery Scott. No, he formed Montgomery Clothier and Tyler in, I think, about 1907 with other big-name Philadelphians. And then that firm went on through World War I, and then there was a kind of, I think, a sort of rebellion against Robert L. Montgomery, and it was challenged, and that firm came apart, and then I think what was left over from that firm later merged with Jani and Company. I think maybe I'm not getting this right. No, Jani was somehow involved early. Then my great-grandfather formed another company, which was Montgomery Scott and Company, with my grandfather and his brother-in-law. And that firm went on, and I think maybe that's the one that merged ultimately with Jani and Company in 1965 or something like that. So yeah, I know lots of boring details about the history of Janny Montgomery Scott.
I believe your father had a complex relationship with Walter Annenberg. Can you say something about that?
I was a child during the period when we lived in London when he was working for Walter Annenberg, and I don't know how complex it was. I mean, you may know much more about it than I do. They were very different characters. My father, the sort of urbane, Protestant, old Philadelphia type, and Walter Annenberg, a very different figure who'd made a lot of money and, brilliant in a lot of ways, but they were quite a match. I got the sense that they worked reasonably well together, but I don't know a lot about that, and I know that Walter Annenberg did finally decide to give his collection to the Met, and that some people wondered whether my father was somehow implicated in that decision. I can't say that I know that for sure, because I think any person with a big art collection would probably like to get it into the Met, but if you have anything to volunteer here, I'd be interested. I know my father was very fond of Walter Annenberg, but my father was a complicated character, and so was Walter Annenberg. I wouldn't doubt that there was conflict at some points, but I don't know much about it.
Working for places like the Art Museum and the orchestra in Philadelphia, your father would have had to deal with the political scene in the city. And I wonder if you can talk about that. I picture your father in a tuxedo and Rizzo in a tuxedo with a
With a nightstick in his
nightstick
cummerbund?
in his cummerbund. But I wonder if you would talk about that dichotomy and how he got along with the powers that be that run the city.
I didn't do a huge amount of research on this, but I do know that he had some intense dealings with the Rendell administration during the time that he was president of the Art Museum, and that was a period of incredible fiscal stress on the city and attempts to reduce the contribution of the city to the museum. You probably know more about this than I do. And I also had the impression that there were people within the Rendell administration, not necessarily Rendell himself, who were kind of put off by my father's, aristocratic ways, and that, that there was tension there. And there's probably all sorts of other tensions. But there were aspects of this story that I applied my reportorial skills to, but there was so much of my father's life that I couldn't possibly report out everything. And it's an interesting question, but I don't know much more than what I just told you.
So if you look at the other very wealthy family dynasties in the East Coast, the Rockefellers in New York and the Kennedys in Boston. They lived in the city. They were part of the fabric of the city. They were part of the planning commissions. They were part of the zoning boards. Did you find anything in the history of your family, your grandparents, great-grandparents, why they chose to go out into the country and do a Shangri-La and isolate themselves and not be part of the fabric of what the city was becoming?
That's a really interesting question. I should protest that my family is not in any way like the Rockefellers. My impression is that when Colonel Montgomery built Androssan, that was kind of all the rage among people who'd made a lot of money in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Philadelphia. That lots and lots, that's what the main line is, lots and lots of rich people made a ton of money in the industries that were big in Philadelphia then, and the Pennsylvania Railroad deliberately cultivated that line as a development scheme to get people to go out, and which everybody did, and they built their enormous palaces, some of them considerably bigger than Androssan. So I don't think there was anything abnormal about that, but you're right that they weren't particularly involved in the nitty-gritty life of the city. In a way, my father was more so than some of them, although my grandfather, was a prominent stockbroker, and I think the head of the Philadelphia Stock Exchange for a while, that kind of thing. But they had some engagement. My grandfather was on the sewer commission, and the colonel, I think, had been involved in local Republican politics. But yeah, it's not like a big urban-based dynasty. But I don't know that was that unusual here, because so many other families went out and did the same thing.
Movie, A Philadelphia Story, is that really about your family? And if it is, did Katherine Hepburn get that right?
That's really funny. Yeah, amazingly, my grandfather met Philip Barry, the playwright, at Harvard around 1919 in a playwriting workshop, and they became very close. And when my grandparents were married, when Philip Barry and his wife were married, my grandfather was an usher, and when my grandparents married, the Barrys frequently came to Androssan. And so when he wrote the Philadelphia Story, the play, he dedicated it to Hope and Edgar Scott. And if you read the play, there's all sorts of details about that household and that family that's drift in there. One of the most remarkable ones to me is an offhand comment about going off to Paris with Leopold Stokowski, because my grandmother's younger sister had famously had two great romantic adventures with Leopold Stokowski. And that's like dropped in there. And there's all sorts of details that if you know the family story. But I don't think it's absolutely clear that my grandmother was in any way particularly like Tracy Lord. And I think if you look at which I have at the Barry papers at Yale and everything that's been written about it, you can see that Barry had the idea for it, liked the setting, and then took it to Katherine Hepburn, who was at a moment, she was in her box office poison phase when she'd had a couple of flops, and she wanted a big winner. And she said, you know, make that character like me, but make her go all soft. So the character was really shaped around Katherine Hepburn. But around the 60s or early 70s, it came to be said that, you know, every piece that was written about my grandmother, it was like, she's the model for Tracy Lord. And my grandmother didn't, it appears, go out of her way to correct that. Even though in quiet moments within the family, she'd say, I really don't think she's that much like me, and it might have been more like my younger sister. So it's a funny thing. And so when my grandmother died, partly on the strength, I mean, my grandmother did many interesting things, but partly on the strength of that, the Philadelphia Inquirer stripped her obituary across the top of the front page in type about the size of your fist. And I noticed that when the Pope died, not long afterward, the coverage was barely different from my grandmother's death.
At the end of your father's life, he devoted an enormous amount of time and energy and money to restoring Androssan to the main house. Why was, knowing the complexity of his life, why was that so important to him, and what was he really trying to save at that point?
Well, that is very much one of the questions I wondered about, not just why he self-destructed, but why he spent the better part of 9 years, and like you say, a lot of inherited money, restoring a house that even real estate people would say has questionable value in the 21st century. And I was fascinated by that. When I went back and looked at his life, I saw that there was a whole history of big houses, big palaces built by family members, not just Androssan, but the grandfather who committed suicide in France built this fantastic palace in Maine, which lasted all of 45 years and finally had to be just torn down, even though it was built to last for the ages. And there was another house that his father had grown up in Lansdowne, that's now a ruin. And there was a sort of, I think, a kind of reverence for these palaces. And then on top of that, his mother had, when her parents died, had devoted herself to keeping the farm going, keeping resuscitating her father's dairy herd, building it into, you know, the most highly producing Ayrshire herd of its size in the country, and keeping the family together on this place. And so I think there was a feeling of familial, of devotion to family and to that idea, and also a kind of love of these grand places. That's all I can ascribe it to. And also, it was at a time in his life where he had been relieved or retired from, however you want to put it, his job at the museum. His marriage had ended, his parents had died, and that became his great project. And I do think another final part of it is that he thought possibly that if he could make the house have the kind of cultural weight that it needed, he would then perhaps be able to save some of the land. So I think it was an attempt at even though he understood this was all, as he once said, going, going, gone, it was an attempt to kind of keep it going, going, gone.
Why was that volume of the diaries separate from the others, the one you first saw? And once you discovered the stash of all the others, did you have to tear up your outline and start a whole new book?
I'd left a nice spot there for that if I was ever going to. I don't know what that diary was doing. It was in a box, like an old dish box, and under a huge heap of love letters that had been written to one of his father's sisters that they'd been given to him to be kept in his custody. I don't know why it was there. And we only went fishing through that, my daughter and I, fishing through that box because my mother pointed it out and said maybe some of those letters are interesting. So I don't know. He refers in that diary to the fact that there were 3 earlier documents or diaries that he wanted to find and couldn't find, and I would have loved to have found those. And as for my outline, no, it worked well. I was very fortunate because it would have been a much flimsier book if I hadn't had the story from in his own words.
As you were writing this book, did you read other books by like authors? You know, I think of John Cheever's daughter wrote a book about her father and living with the Cheevers, and it seems like you put a lot of your empathy, because you obviously loved your father as well.
I know Susan Cheever's book. I haven't read it in years, and I did not look at other books because I really didn't want to be influenced. But I have to say, going back, the book that made me think I could possibly do something with this material was Edmund DeWall's book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, which, if anyone has not read it, I really recommend it. Was, you know, a fantastic family memoir, but that also incorporated the history of Europe in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And that, I'd say, influenced me more than anything else I've read.
Well, thank you, everyone for coming, and thank you especially, Jani.
And thank you, Bruce.